The title of the book, The Symphony of Profound Knowledge, W. Edwards Deming's score for leading, performing, and living in concert. And the author is Edward Martin Baker, and Ed joins us now on iUniverse Radio. Hello, Ed.
Hi, Steve. Good to talk to you.
Well, great to talk to you. And you look to W. Edwards Deming for great insights and leadership in the art of living. He's your mentor, if you will. And so what we're going to talk about as I look at the overview of your book about his teachings, it really comes down to helping leaders understand an individual's mental map, which produces improved human relationships, joy in work, and joy in living. So this is more than just business. This is overall life kind of guidance.
Yes, that's what I was trying to communicate. Deming, of course, was teaching and doing seminars around the U.S. and other parts of the world from the 80s to the beginning of the 90s, and people tagged him with a label of father of total quality excellence, things like that, and they kind of thought it was applying just to manufacturing and production and business, and that, of course, was true, but it was much broader than that. It was a way of thinking that people could apply not just to their positions in organizations, especially the senior management, but also to the way they led their lives. So you mentioned, I used the term mental map. It was a new way of thinking to navigate through life wherever you find yourself, whether it be with your family or in an organization.
Why did you choose this kind of format where we have, I'm looking at your table of contents, you have the overture, the first movement, second movement, third and fourth movement. Why did you format it that way?
Well, Deming, over the years, he always had his teaching, behind his teaching was profound knowledge, but he never labeled it as such until toward the end of the 80s, where he had reduced it to 4 components that he called a system of profound knowledge. And many books have been written. He wrote many books, and he often asked me to write a book, and I said, well, I'm just repeating what I learned from him. And then as the years passed, I began to think that I should write this, and with the support and help of Aileron, I finally decided to work with them and to write this book. But I didn't want to just republish something that somebody else had written. And then I realized, well, he was in addition to everything else, being a physicist, mathematician, statistician, engineer, he was also a music theorist and a musician. And he composed quite a number of pieces. And I thought, well, that sounds like a really interesting way to present his teaching in a different manner. And in fact, that's what he told me when he asked me to write a book. He said, well, your point of view would be a different presentation, and I think that would help people understand what I'm trying to do. So I finally came to that conclusion and presented it as movements of a symphony where there are parts, but all the parts are part of a whole, because system thinking is the ability to relate the parts to the whole and see the big picture. And so that was my thinking on that.
And you spent 13 years with him at Ford Motor Company.
Very fortunate. He came to Ford, in 1980 there was an NBC video, If Japan Can, Why Can't We?, which really stimulated a lot of business executives to call him, because especially the automotive industry was in dire straits since the Japanese were kind of outselling American manufacturers in their products. So people saw this and they invited him to Ford, and it took a while to convince him that Ford management was serious. Some executives visited him in his home in Washington, D.C., and finally he agreed to become a consultant to Ford. Now, first came in January of '81, and he went right to the executive suite and read them the Riot Act, which they accepted because he had the reputation for being able to help organizations. And he came back in February, and there was a meeting, and I attended that meeting. And after that meeting, I sat with him, and I showed him some work I had done and papers I had written in quality and human decision making. And it was based on theory. Now, I don't know if he so much agreed with what I had written, but he liked the idea that I was using theory to develop my thinking. And he asked me what I wanted to do at Ford, and I said, well, I'd like to be in the corporate quality organization. And he didn't say much then, but a few months later, I had an invitation to join the corporate quality office. And that began my 13 years with him. 12 of them while I was still at Ford, and then in 1993, I had left in 92 and 93. I also continued to work with him. But it was a matter of working with him in seminars, and later on in the 80s, I took over and managed his relationship with Ford. In other words, scheduled meetings with senior executives and also with the shop floor. He did love to visit the plant and talk to the people and get firsthand what their experiences were.
Now, in your first movement called Theory of Knowledge, one of the chapters is Management is Prediction. Why don't you give us a little sense of that? Give us a little insight in Management is Prediction.
Yeah. I think in the kind of a way Deming looked at knowledge, epistemology as some call it, theory of knowledge, the only measure really of a person's knowledge is the accuracy of his prediction. In other words, could he tell us how the forces are going to come together to produce certain results and events and outcomes in the future? So he said it's really management's responsibility is the future of the company. And to the extent that they could predict, which means not just to guess, but to shape the future of the company, that is a key component of leadership.
You talk about, as you described what your book was about Dr. Deming's performance on stage, especially his conduct of the red bead demonstration. And so tell us about that. Give us a little view of why you felt this was so important.
Well, everybody did, and he did that the second day of his 4-day seminars. And it was after that and his debriefing that people began to get a real feeling of his message. He called people up onto the stage to play various roles of inspector or production operator, and it was real theater, Steve. I'm telling you, it was just incredible. It was captivating, and he had people sample from this box of beads over and over again, and he used the results. Some of the beads were defective and some of the beads were okay. The red ones are defective, the white ones are okay. And he recorded. He had a recorder plot record the results of the experiment. And he would insist that people don't produce red beads. Well, of course, the system wouldn't allow them not to produce red beads. But yet, after each day, after each demonstration, he played the role of supervisor, a really hard-nosed supervisor, and would criticize those who picked too many red beads. And of course, over time, people varied. If they did poorly on one day, they did great the next. And he was trying to show that management doesn't have enough knowledge of a system to know when the system is producing the results or when it's the individual. And most of the time, it's the system. And yet, people are fired. In fact, he fired the 3 worst workers and kept the 3 best ones after 4 days. And lo and behold, even though they were labeled as best, as one might in a performance evaluation, half of them were below average, and they all did poorly. So that began to get people to listen to his message. So he took his theory of variation, in that case, theory of variation, theory of a system, and applied it to a real-life demonstration, something he could do on the stage.
Now, Jim Macingvale, is that his name?
Macingvale.
Macingvale, the owner of Gallery Furniture in Texas. He attended one of these seminars, and people were saying, don't follow Deming's advice. It's going to be disastrous. And yet, obviously, the rest is history.
Yeah, that was the same kind of advice that people thought in business leaders and organizations. Like, well, why should I change? I've been successful doing it the old way. And that's what people told Jim Macingvale. He built a successful furniture sales business by doing things a certain way, the old way, which was incentives and bonuses and tried to motivate his employees by putting them in internal competition with each other and for the best results. And so his situation was, at that time he had one location, and yet he wanted to increase sales. He was up to about $50 million a year, which was pretty good for a single store. But he was looking for ways to improve his sales and grow the company even further, and he wanted to be able to do it through his management technique, not so much of more real estate. So he did attend a Deming seminar with his wife, Linda, and they kind of liked what they heard. And they said, well, gee, let me try it. And I thought that was amazing given his management style. But he did try it. And, of course, some people didn't like it. They were all taken off commission and put on salary. And they were also put on profit sharing, so that helped. Some people left. They didn't want to work under that way because they thought they were the best salespeople. Well, Jim said, okay, well, let them go. I'll bring in people that will be able to fit into my new management style. And, of course, he lapsed back once in a while, but eventually he continued to manage the new way and continue to grow the business. Of course, now he has a couple of stores in Houston. But I thought it was just amazing that a person like him could make that kind of transformation of thinking, change his mental map.
So it went from competition to more cooperation.
Absolutely, not where people inside the organization could help each other. In other words, if one person couldn't close on a certain level of furniture, high-quality furniture, expensive, they could bring in one of their associates to help close the sale.
So your book is based on the character and the teaching of W. Edwards Deming. As we wrap up the interview, give us some closing thoughts on this man's profound impact on your life.
He changed my life. I went to graduate school. I studied industrial and organization psychology and some statistics. In fact, I had a teaching fellowship, and I taught Statistics 101. And after spending time with him, I learned that, number one, a lot of what I learned in psychology and industrial psychology, such as performance evaluations, the way they were conducted, was not appropriate. In fact, it could be harmful. And number two, I regretted the way I taught statistics. Not so much that I taught the traditional way that people learn in Statistics 101, hypothesis testing and things like that. But I didn't know how to put it in the right context. And if I were to teach it again, I would put it in the context of Deming's teachings, where he would teach variation and what it means to look at data over time. So within the context of Deming's teaching, statistics would have been more appropriate and more usable and more practical. But the way I taught it, then I think students would still have had a tough time applying it.
We've been talking with Edward Martin Baker. He's the author of his book, The Symphony of Profound Knowledge. W. Edwards Deming score for leading, performing, and living in concert. Ed, what's the best way to get your book?
Amazon.com. I think most bookstores will either have it on the shelf or you could order it from the bookstore or iUniverse, the publisher.
Thank you so much, Ed, for joining us on iUniverse Radio.
Well, thank you very much for this interview.